There is a volcano underneath a European city, and the scientists who monitor it say they have absolutely no idea what condition it is in. Those are close to their exact words. On Friday evening, the ground 3 kilometres beneath a town of 80,000 people broke and produced the strongest earthquake ever recorded there since monitoring began. 26 people were injured. 2 of them are critical. 300 cannot go home, and the alert level did not move. Tonight I want to show you the study that landed within hours of that rupture, what it found about where the fluids underneath that town are travelling, and the emergency plan that is supposed to move 500,000 people in 72 hours. Because the frightening part of this story is not the volcano. It is the answer nobody in Italy will give. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Let's get into it. Part 1. 46 minutes past 7. The ground under Pozzuoli broke at 46 minutes past 7 in the evening, and it broke shallow. 3 kilometres down, 1.9 miles. That is not a number you have to reach for a comparison to understand, because 1.9 miles is a distance you could walk in half an hour on a flat road. It is closer than most people live from their nearest supermarket. And on the evening of July 31st, 2026, that thin sliver of rock underneath one of the most densely populated volcanic fields on the planet tore and released a magnitude 4.7. I want to be very precise about what that number means, because the entire argument that follows depends on it. 4.7 is the strongest earthquake ever recorded at the Campi Flegrei caldera since systematic instrumental monitoring of that volcano began. Not the strongest this year, not the strongest this decade, the strongest since scientists started measuring it properly with instruments. It is also the strongest earthquake felt across the Campania region in roughly 40 years. Some of the local commentary has gone further and called it the strongest event at this volcano since the eruption of Monte Nuovo in 1538, and I want to flag that carefully, because that is a claim about the historical record rather than the instrumental one. The honest version is the first one, and the first one is already remarkable enough. Here is what happened in the minutes afterward. 26 people were injured. 5 of them went to hospital. 2 of those are in critical condition. A man was buried in his car underneath a boulder that came off a slope during the shaking, and he was pulled out alive, which is the kind of detail that tends to get compressed into a single line in a wire report and then forgotten. He was in his vehicle. A rock came down. It took people to get him out. Buildings collapsed. Walls failed. Rockfalls crushed cars where they were parked. Homes were damaged. Businesses were damaged. Churches were damaged. And historical landmarks in an area that has been continuously inhabited for well over 2,000 years were damaged or destroyed outright. Water went out. Power went out. Around 300 residents were pushed out of their homes and could not go back, and the alert level did not change. That is the sentence I want you to sit with, because it is the door into everything else. The strongest earthquake in this volcano's monitored history happened. It injured people for the first time in this entire crisis. It put 300 residents on the street, and the official classification of how dangerous Campi Flegrei currently is did not move a single step. There is a defensible scientific reason for that, and I am going to give it to you fairly because it matters. But there is also a much less comfortable reason sitting underneath it, and that one is the story. Let me tell you the thing that surprised me most when I went through the material, and it is not any of the damage figures. It is this. The scientists who have spent their entire careers instrumenting this caldera, who have monitoring stations planted on it, who read the deformation bulletins every month, are saying openly and on the record that they do not know what stage of this crisis they are in. Not that they disagree about it. Not that the models are contested. That they do not know. One of them used the word patient, as in a person on a hospital bed, and said we have absolutely no idea what condition this patient is in. That is where this video is going. Not to a prediction, because nobody has one worth the breath. It is going somewhere considerably more uncomfortable than a prediction. It is going to the gap between what is known about this volcano and what has actually been prepared for underneath it, and to the specific arithmetic of moving a very large number of people off a piece of ground that is currently rising, shaking, and venting gas. Before we go further, though, you need to understand the shape of the thing we're talking about, because almost everyone gets this wrong on the first pass, and getting it wrong makes the rest of the story impossible to follow. Campi Flegrei is not a mountain. When most people hear the word volcano, they picture a cone, a peak with a crater at the top sitting on a plain with a town at a respectful distance from its base. That is Vesuvius, which is about 9 kilometres away on the other side of Naples, and Vesuvius behaves the way your mental image expects a volcano to behave. It has a summit, it has flanks, there is an inside and an outside. Campi Flegrei has none of that. It is a caldera, roughly 12 kilometres by 15 kilometres, which is what you get when a volcanic system erupts so violently that it empties its own magma chamber and the roof of that chamber collapses downward into the void. What is left behind is not a peak, it is a depression, a broad, low, irregular basin full of smaller craters, steaming vents, hot ground, and hills that are themselves the wreckage of older eruptions. And people did not build around it, they built on it. That single fact reorganizes everything. There is no safe side of this mountain to live on, because there is no mountain. Over centuries, towns filled in the caldera floor. Pozzuoli sits inside it. Boccoli, Quarto, and Giuliano sit inside or against it. Naples itself has neighbourhoods that reach into the exposed zone. Rail tunnels run through the caldera. A port operates inside it. There are schools, hospitals, apartment blocks, hotels and restaurants sitting directly on top of an active volcanic system. And they got there gradually, over a very long time, in a place that is genuinely beautiful and has been considered desirable since the Romans built holiday villas there. The Solfatara crater, which is where the epicentre of the July 31st earthquake was located, is one of the places where you can walk up and watch steam come out of the ground. It is estimated to be the most likely location of a future eruption. It is also, and I do not say this to be dramatic, surrounded by ordinary daily life. So when the ground moved on July 31st, it did not move under a national park with a visitor centre and a car park. It moved 5 kilometres east of the centre of Pozzuoli, 9 kilometres west of the centre of Naples, in the middle of a summer evening at the height of tourist season, with the streets full. Now here is where the reassuring version of this story lives, and I want to give it to you properly rather than skipping past it. The Italian National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, the INGV, which operates the Vesuvius Observatory in Naples and runs the monitoring network on this caldera, has been consistent. Their institutional position is that there is no signal of magma moving toward the shallowest portions of the volcano, and no reason to expect the system to evolve toward an eruptive phase. That is not a press release designed to calm people down. It is a statement grounded in what the instruments are showing about where the energy is coming from and how deep it is. The rupture itself supports that reading. When you work out the mechanics of the July 31st event, what you get is normal faulting. Extensional movement, one block dropping relative to another, with no volumetric component. In plain terms, that is the signature of rock pulling apart and slipping, which is what happens when a piece of crust is being stretched or is failing under stress. It is not the signature of something pushing outward from within, which is what you would expect to see if a body of magma were forcing its way upward through the last 3 kilometres. There is also a subtlety in the magnitude itself that almost nobody has reported, and it is worth 30 seconds. The 4.7 figure is a duration magnitude. That is one way of measuring an earthquake's size based essentially on how long the shaking signal lasts on the instruments. There is another scale, moment magnitude, which is calculated from the actual physical properties of the rupture, and on that scale this event comes out at around 4.2. Both numbers are real. They are measuring slightly different things, and the record was set on the duration scale. Why does that matter? Because published modelling work on this specific caldera had placed an expected ceiling on how large an earthquake this system could produce, somewhere in the region of moment magnitude 4.4. So what actually happened on July 31st is genuinely strange and genuinely nuanced at the same time. The volcano set an all-time instrumental record, and it did so without breaching the theoretical ceiling that had been calculated for it. Both of those statements are true simultaneously. That is the reassuring reading, and it is not a whitewash. It is real science, from the people best placed to do it. So why am I making this video? Because there is a second set of numbers, and the second set does not sit comfortably next to the first one at all. The ground is still rising at roughly 1 centimetre per month, which does not sound like much until you understand that it has been doing versions of this for decades, and has already lifted the town by an amount measured in metres. The gas coming out of the system has increased sharply, to the point where a railway tunnel had to be closed because the concentration inside it made running trains through it unsafe. 26 people are injured, 2 of them critically, for the first time in this entire crisis. And a brand new study released within hours of the earthquake has identified precisely where on this volcano the rupture happened, and that location turns out to be considerably more interesting than anyone would like. There is a version of this event where the fact that the alert level did not move is the most reassuring detail available, and there is a version where it is the most alarming one. Which of those you're looking at depends entirely on a question that nobody currently has an answer to. Part 2. The buildings that lean on each other. Let me deal with the objection first, because it arrives in the comments within about 4 minutes of any video on this topic, and it is not a stupid objection. It goes like this: a 4.7 is nothing. I live in California, or Japan, or Chile, and we get magnitude 4.7s all the time, and nothing happens. Nobody gets hurt. Buildings do not fall down. This is being blown out of proportion. That objection is entirely reasonable if you have only ever experienced earthquakes in a place with modern seismic building codes, and it is wrong here, for 3 separate reasons that stack on top of each other. I want to take them one at a time, because understanding why this particular 4.7 did this particular amount of damage is how you understand why the rest of this story is serious. The first reason is depth. This earthquake occurred at approximately 3 kilometers. A great many of the moderate earthquakes people experience in California occur at 10, 15, 20 kilometers or deeper. Depth matters enormously for what happens at the surface, because seismic energy spreads outward in 3 dimensions and attenuates as it travels. An earthquake at 20 kilometers has 20 kilometers of rock to dissipate its energy through before it reaches a building's foundations. An earthquake at 3 kilometers has 3. The same amount of released energy, concentrated into a much smaller area at the surface, produces far more violent shaking directly above the rupture. Pozzuoli was not near the epicenter. Pozzuoli was on top of it. The second reason is the buildings. This is the one that structural engineers who have worked in the region keep coming back to, and the language they use is unusually blunt. The affected housing stock includes a large volume of old masonry construction, and the assessment from experts who have looked at these structures is that many of them are, functionally, leaning on each other. The mortar between the bricks has degraded over decades, and in some cases has effectively turned to dust. What is holding those walls up is not the strength of the bond between the bricks. It is friction, compression, and the fact that the building next door is doing the same thing from the other side. You cannot compare that to a building erected under California's seismic code. It is not the same object. Give both of them the same ground acceleration, and one flexes and stays up, and the other sheds material into the street. That is not a difference of degree, it is a difference of kind, and it is why an earthquake that would be a talking point in Los Angeles put 26 people in hospital, and 2 of them in critical condition in Pozzuoli. The third reason is the one that actually matters most, and it is the one the comparison completely misses. There is no volcano underneath the San Andreas Fault. That sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but follow it through. In California, a magnitude 4.7 is a discrete event. Stress accumulated on a fault over years or decades. The fault slipped, the stress dropped, and now the system has less energy in it than it did yesterday. It is, in a real sense, over. What happened in Pozzuoli is not a discrete event. It is a symptom of a process that is still running underneath the town right now, tonight, while you're watching this. The gas is still coming up. The ground is still rising. The pressure that produced this rupture did not go away when the rupture happened, because the thing generating that pressure is still generating it. The comparison fails at the source, not at the effects. And that distinction is exactly why the question of what stage this crisis is in is not academic. There is a fourth factor as well, and it is the one that worries the engineers most, because it does not show up in any single event. It is cumulative. Consider what has actually happened to these buildings over the past year and a half. This is not the first magnitude 4 class earthquake to hit Pozzuoli. It is the latest in a series of them, spaced out over months, each one shaking the same walls, loosening the same mortar, opening the same hairline cracks a little wider. A masonry building that survives a magnitude 4.4 is not the same building afterwards. It has absorbed energy, and some of that energy went into permanent damage that nobody inspected because the wall was still standing and there was no obvious reason to look. Then the next one arrives, and the next, and the threshold at which that wall finally lets go moves down a little each time. This is why the argument about whether an eruption is coming, while genuinely important, is also in a strange way a distraction. You do not need an eruption to produce a disaster here. You need a sequence of moderate earthquakes on degraded masonry with people inside it, which is precisely what has been happening and which culminated on July 31st in the first injuries of the entire crisis. The volcano does not have to do anything spectacular. It only has to keep doing what it is already doing. So let us look at what actually happened to the town, because the details are more specific than the summaries suggest. The physical damage was distributed rather than concentrated. Walls failed, not always the whole building. A hillside came down. There is footage of a landslide in Pozzuoli. A section of building facade came off and landed on parked cars below it. Rockfalls crushed vehicles. Several structures collapsed outright, and it appears that the ones that came down completely happened to be uninhabited at the time, which is the single luckiest fact in this entire event, and one that should not be relied upon to repeat. Then the infrastructure went. The Naples rail network was suspended, and delays on regional lines ran to more than 6 hours. That is not incidental. The rail lines serving this area run through tunnels cut into the caldera, which means the transport spine of the whole district passes through exactly the ground that is deforming and fracturing. The port of Pozzuoli closed. Water supply was lost in affected areas. Power was lost. Follow that chain through, because it has a shape. The port closing is not just an inconvenience for commuters. Pozzuoli is a departure point for ferries to the islands, and the islands are on the seaward side of the exposed zone. Every route out of this district was degraded within minutes of the rupture. The train stopped because the tunnels run through the deforming ground. The port stopped because it is inside the affected area. The roads were blocked by material that came off the buildings lining them, and the water and power failures meant that the people who stayed were sitting in the dark in August, without running water, listening to the ground continue to move. None of that required an eruption. All of it was produced by a magnitude 4.7 at 3 kilometres depth, which is an event the models had already said to expect. And here is the detail that I think is the most important single fact in the entire event, more important than the magnitude, more important than the injury count. The evacuation routes were blocked. Collapsed buildings across roads, boulders in the carriageway, parked cars, some crushed, some simply abandoned where they were. The streets in this part of the caldera are in many places narrow and winding, laid out long before anyone was designing for vehicular evacuation, and lined on both sides with parked vehicles because there is nowhere else to put them. A magnitude 4.7 blocked them. I want you to hold that thought, because we are going to come back to it in a way that I suspect will change how you think about this entire situation. The official emergency plan for Campi Flegrei is built on the assumption that when an alarm is raised, people leave. That is the mechanism. That is the whole protection. And on July 31st, an earthquake that did not remotely approach the worst-case scenario for this volcano physically closed the roads that people would need to use. Around 300 residents were forced from their homes. I should be honest about the reporting here, because the numbers have moved and different sources have counted different things. Some reporting described roughly 130 to 150 family units displaced, which works out to something close to 290 people. Some early international reporting had considerably lower figures, in the region of 18 families. Officials indicated the number could triple as damage assessments proceeded. The injury count has the same problem, with 26 injured and 2 critical circulating alongside an earlier figure of 21 injured, with 2 seriously wounded. I am giving you the range rather than pretending there is a single clean number, because on the second day after an event like this there is not one. What is not in dispute is the qualitative fact underneath all of those figures. Across the entire current crisis at this volcano, which has been running for years and has produced multiple magnitude 4 class earthquakes, this is the first event to injure people. Not the first to frighten people, not the first to crack plaster, the first to send people to hospital. That threshold got crossed on July 31st, and it got crossed by an earthquake that the models had already told scientists to expect. There is a version of this where that is reassuring, because the system behaved as predicted. And there is a version where it is the opposite, because it means the thing that finally hurt people was not a surprise to anybody who was paying attention. Which brings us to the man who spent years saying exactly this would happen, and who gave an interview 2 days ago that I think is one of the more remarkable things I have read from a working scientist. But before we get to him, there is something about the shaking itself that has not been widely reported, and it changes the picture again. Part 3, 200. The main shock was not the event. The main shock was the loudest part of the event. What followed through the night of July 31st and into the days after was a sequence, and the size of that sequence is where the story starts to separate from the headlines. Counting the earthquakes in this swarm gets you to approximately 200 events. If you include the very small ones, the events below magnitude 1 that a general audience would never feel, and that only exist as wiggles on an instrument, the number goes higher still. I want to flag something about that figure, because it is a good example of how a story gets distorted without anyone lying. Some early agency summaries of this event listed around 10 aftershocks. 10. If you read that number, you would conclude the sequence was small and had essentially stopped. But that figure reflects a reporting threshold, not the seismicity. It is counting the events above a certain size that get individually published in a particular feed. The actual ground underneath Pozzuoli was doing something roughly 20 times busier than that number suggests. Scrolling through the event list is a genuinely uncomfortable experience, and I do not mean that as a figure of speech. It is line after line after line of timestamps, hour by hour through the night, in a town where people were trying to work out whether it was safe to go back inside their own houses. Now here is the part that matters scientifically, and it is subtle. The magnitudes in this sequence are high. After the 4.7 came a 3.8, then several events above magnitude 3, then a set in the 2.5 range. For a tectonic aftershock sequence following a 4.7, that distribution would be unremarkable. For a volcanic unrest sequence, it is not. Volcanic seismicity, driven by fluids moving and rock fracturing around a hydrothermal system, tends to produce enormous numbers of very small events with comparatively few larger ones. What Campi Flegrei produced was a swarm weighted toward the upper end. That is a system releasing energy in larger chunks than it usually does. There is a standard way seismologists describe this, and it is worth understanding in plain language because it tells you something the raw counts do not. In any population of earthquakes, small ones vastly outnumber large ones, and the ratio between them is fairly consistent for a given setting. Shift that ratio toward the larger end, and you're looking at rock that is failing in bigger pieces than usual. It can mean the material has become more uniformly stressed, or that it has been weakened to the point where cracks propagate further before they arrest instead of stopping after a few meters. Neither of those interpretations is comforting when the rock in question is the roof over a pressurized hydrothermal system, with a town on top of it. And this sequence did not appear from nothing. It sits at the top of a ladder that has been building for well over a year. The current unrest has produced a run of magnitude 4 class earthquakes, stepping upward over time, with the previous instrumental maxima of this crisis being magnitude 4.6 class events, recorded during 2025. Each of those was described at the time as the strongest in decades. Each of them was then exceeded. That is the pattern to hold on to. This volcano has been setting and breaking its own records, repeatedly, over a period of months, in a system where the deformation has never stopped and the gas output has been climbing. July 31st was not a departure from the trend. It was the trend continuing, and this leads directly into the single most commonly misunderstood thing about this entire crisis, which I want to spend a moment on because it is the foundation for everything in the second half of this video. These are not tectonic earthquakes. I know that sounds like a technicality. It is not. When people compare this to California, they are implicitly assuming the same physics is at work, with a fault under strain that eventually slips. There are faults here, and they do slip, but the faults are not the cause. They are a consequence. The land is rising. The hydrothermal system underneath is expanding. Fault structures are being created and reactivated by that process. The earthquakes are the sound of rock breaking because something underneath it is pushing, heating, and pressurizing. That distinction changes what an earthquake means. In a tectonic setting, a moderate earthquake generally releases stress and makes the immediate situation slightly safer. In a volcanic setting, where the driver is still running, a moderate earthquake tells you the driver is winning. Which brings us to the most counterintuitive observation in the entire dataset. The ground is still rising at approximately 1 centimeter per month. That is the deformation signal, and there is no immediate correlation between the rate at which the ground rises and when the earthquakes occur. Read that again, because it is the trap that a lot of people fell into. If uplift and seismicity move together, you could use one to predict the other. A quiet month of earthquakes would mean a quiet month of deformation, and you could reasonably conclude the system was settling. But they are decoupled, and in the months before July 31st, the seismicity did get quieter. People noticed. A lot of observers, including some who follow this volcano closely, took that quiet period as evidence that the crisis was winding down. It was not winding down, and the reason it was not is a specific technical point made by one of the scientists who works on this caldera, which I will get to shortly, and which reframes the quiet period entirely. There is one more observation from this same window that should have made the reassuring reading much harder to sustain, and it involves gas rather than shaking. The flux of gas coming out of this system is described as enormous and as having increased dramatically. That is not a subtle instrumental signal buried in a bulletin. The consequence was operational and visible. A railway tunnel had to be closed because the concentration of gas inside it was high enough that running trains through it was not safe. Think about what that requires. Gas is entering an enclosed underground space from the surrounding rock in sufficient volume and at sufficient rate to exceed a safety threshold in a working transport tunnel. That is the hydrothermal system doing more, not less. And it was happening during the same period when the earthquake count dropped and people concluded things were calming down. We covered that tunnel in our video from July 14th, and at the time it felt like a strange, almost incidental story. A rail line closed because of gas. It reads like a maintenance issue. What it actually was, in hindsight, is the clearest possible physical demonstration that this system's output was rising in the weeks before the record earthquake, in a form that could be measured with an instrument any industrial safety officer would recognize. The lid was leaking visibly into a tunnel people ride through, and it was leaking harder. 2.5 weeks later, the same ground produced the largest earthquake ever recorded here. So the picture going into July 31st was this: uplift continuing, gas output climbing sharply, seismicity apparently quieter, and a general public reading of the situation that was based almost entirely on the third of those three signals, because it is the one you can feel. The earthquake on July 31st did not create a new situation. It revealed one that was already there, and the scientist who had been saying so in public for a considerable time gave an interview in the immediate aftermath that I want to walk you through in detail, not because he predicted the earthquake, because nobody predicts earthquakes, and he would be the first to say so, but because of what he said when he was asked a much simpler question about where we are in this crisis, and because his answer was not the answer anybody expects from a man who has instrumented this volcano for a living. Part 4. The risk was underestimated. Giuseppe Mastro Lorenzo is a volcanologist and researcher. He has worked for the NGV. He has studied this caldera for many years, and critically, for a story where the credibility of the speaker is constantly under attack, he is local. He lives with this thing. I emphasize that because there is a particular pattern that shows up whenever this volcano is discussed, and it goes something like this. Somebody will say they know a professor, based in the United States or Australia or the United Kingdom, who thinks the whole thing is overblown. And that may well be true, but there is a meaningful difference between an assessment made from 10,000 kilometers away and an assessment made by someone who reads the instruments on this specific system, who was there when the ground moved, and whose own family is inside the exposed zone. Both are worth hearing. They are not equivalent. Mastro Lorenzo was interviewed after the earthquake, and I want to take his answers in order, because they build. He was asked how we should interpret what had happened. His answer, quoted directly, "In my opinion, this is the result of the risk having been underestimated. I have been saying for some time that the Brady seismic crisis has not ended, and that stronger earthquakes than those already experienced had to be expected. That is a scientist saying, on the record, in the immediate aftermath of an event that hospitalized 26 people, that the reason it hurt people is that the danger had been assessed too low. Not that the earthquake was unforeseeable, that the risk was underestimated. The word Brady seismic is worth 30 seconds, because it will come up repeatedly, and it is the technical name for the phenomenon at the center of this entire story. Bradycism means, roughly, slow earthquake, and it describes the gradual vertical movement of the ground surface, up or down, in a volcanic caldera. Campi Flegrei is the type example of it worldwide. There is a Roman market building in Pozzuoli, whose columns carry a band of marine boring mollusk holes several meters above the current ground level, which means that over the centuries this piece of land sank far enough for the sea to cover those columns, and then rose again far enough to lift them back out. The ground here breathes. It has been doing so for a very long time. What is happening now is an inflation phase, and it has been running since roughly 1950. That is the timescale to keep in your head when someone suggests the current unrest was caused by drilling, or by geothermal energy extraction, or by weapons testing. The cycle predates all of those proposals by decades, and the eruption of 1538 was preceded by meters of the same kind of rise in a caldera that is roughly 40,000 years old, with the source of the current unrest sitting at 4 to 5 kilometers depth. The pattern is far older than any human activity being blamed for it. Now, the second thing Mastro Lorenzo said, and this is the one that dismantles the quiet period. He noted that the ground is still rising at approximately 1 centimetre per month. He noted that above all the flow of gas is enormous and has increased dramatically, and then he addressed the decoupling directly. There is no immediate correlation, he said, between the uplift of the ground and the occurrence of the earthquakes. Therefore many people had reassured themselves by believing that the seismic activity was dying down, and then the line that reframes the whole preceding months. In reality, it is simply the distribution of the earthquakes that has changed. Not the intensity, the distribution. The system did not get quieter in any meaningful energetic sense. The earthquakes moved. I want to make sure that lands, because it is the difference between two completely opposite readings of the same data. If seismicity declines because the system is losing energy, that is de-escalation. If the same amount of stress is being released, but in a different place, that is not de-escalation at all. That is the problem relocating. And if you're only counting events in your usual monitoring window, a relocation can look exactly like a decline. That is how a volcano that was building toward its largest recorded earthquake managed to look, to a lot of observers, like it was calming down. Then he was asked what I consider the most important question anybody has asked about Campi Flegrei this year. He was asked in effect at what stage of this crisis we are compared with previous crises. His answer began, "That is an excellent question, because we simply do not know." He continued, and I am going to quote this at length because paraphrasing it would soften it, and it should not be softened. I have been saying for some time that we have absolutely no idea what condition this patient is in. People are often led to believe that the monitoring system can provide us with a reasonably reliable indication of the current level of danger, but we absolutely do not know what stage of the phenomenon's evolution we are currently experiencing. We could be very close to even more critical events, or this could be a relatively stable phase in which events such as these continue to occur. I've gone back over that quote several times, and I keep landing in the same place. This is one of the most heavily monitored volcanoes on Earth. There are seismic stations, satellite deformation measurements, permanent ground-based positioning receivers, gas sampling from the fumaroles, tilt meters, and a research literature going back decades. It is studied by INGV, by the University of Naples Federico Thurn, and by international collaborations. If any active volcano on the planet should be legible, it is this one. And the honest answer from a man who works on it is that we do not know whether we are in a stable phase or approaching a far more critical one. Those are not adjacent possibilities. They are opposite ends of the range. Being unable to distinguish between them is not a small gap in knowledge. There is a detail in his answers that is easy to skim past and should not be, because it tells you something about the institutional history here. He mentioned that in 2023 a rapid emergency plan was prepared specifically for this area and for the restricted red zone, precisely because there were concerns that events such as these could occur. Sit with the implication. 3 years ago, somebody in the Italian civil protection system looked at this caldera, concluded that damaging earthquakes were a realistic near-term prospect distinct from the eruption scenario, and commissioned a separate, faster plan to deal with them. The concern that produced July 31st was not only anticipated by scientists, it was anticipated well enough by the state to generate paperwork. Mastro Lorenzo's criticism is not that nobody saw this coming, it is that everybody did, and the gap between seeing it and acting on it never closed. He has said, plainly, that he strongly criticised the national plan, which was designed around the possibility of an eruption and an escalation of events leading toward one, rather than around the thing that has actually been hurting people, which is the shaking itself. He also explained the physical mechanism producing these earthquakes, and it is worth having clearly because it will matter later. These earthquakes, he said, are the result of stress and strain accumulating in the crust beneath our feet, within a layer that is approximately 3 kilometers thick. That layer is the hydrothermal system itself. It expands because of the gases it is placed under stress, and it releases that stress through earthquakes such as these. So picture the structure. There is a heat and gas source at depth. Above it, a zone roughly 3 kilometers thick of hot, fluid-saturated, fractured rock, being pressurized from below. Gas accumulates, pressure builds, rock resists until it cannot, and then it breaks. What you feel at the surface is that breaking. This model has a consequence that cuts both ways, and I want to be scrupulous about it. On the reassuring side, it means these earthquakes are a pressure release symptom rather than a signal of magma physically ascending toward the surface, which is consistent with the institutional position that there is no shallow magma movement. On the other side, the fracturing that relieves pressure also creates and widens pathways through rock. A system that repeatedly breaks itself in the same region does not stay equally sealed. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of place where a channel like this one can slide from reporting into insinuation, and I do not want to do that. The institutional position is that there is no evidence of magma ascending towards shallow levels, and nothing in Mastro Lorenzo's account contradicts that. He is not describing magma at 3 kilometers. He is describing gas and hot fluid, sourced from much deeper, accumulating under a lid and breaking it in pieces. The question that follows is simply whether a lid that keeps breaking stays a lid, which is precisely the point at which a study that came out in the immediate aftermath of this earthquake becomes very difficult to read comfortably, because it took the location of the July 31st rupture, placed it against everything else this caldera has been doing, and found that it landed in a specific place. Not a random place, a structure that has been there for 5,000 years, and that appears to be doing a particular job right now. Part 5. The Ring Beneath Pozzuoli. The study arrived essentially immediately, fresh off the press, released while the aftershocks were still being catalogued, carrying a title to the effect of Strongest Earthquake Ever Recorded at Campi Flegrei, Further Confirmation of the Volcanic System Dynamics. That phrase, further confirmation, is doing a lot of quiet work, and I will come back to it. The first finding restates what we already know, but with the authority of formal analysis rather than a press statement. The magnitude 4.7 is the most energetic earthquake ever recorded in the Campi Flegrei caldera since systematic volcanic monitoring began. That is now on the record in the scientific literature rather than only in the news. The second finding is where it turns. The earthquake, the study says, is located along the northern edge of the caldera's seismogenic volume. I need to unpack that phrase because it contains the whole idea. A seismogenic volume is the region of rock inside which earthquakes are actually being generated. Not the whole caldera, not everywhere the ground is rising, a specific three-dimensional zone where the failures occur. And what the researchers are reporting is that after years of accumulating events, the shape of that zone has become clear enough to describe. It is becoming increasingly well-defined, they write, as an elliptical ring that bounds the seismicity. A ring. Think about what that means physically. The earthquakes at Campi Flegrei are not scattered randomly through the caldera like static. They are not concentrated in a single blob under the center either. They are arranged around a closed loop, an ellipse, with the seismicity happening on the boundary of that loop rather than inside it. Something in the middle is being pushed. The ring is where the surrounding rock is failing in response. If you have ever pressed your thumb up into a sheet of stretch material, you know intuitively what shape the stress takes. It does not fail at the point of contact. It fails around it, in a circle, where the material is being pulled hardest by the deformation in the middle. That is what a ring fracture is, and it is one of the most fundamental structures in caldera volcanology, because a caldera is quite literally what happens when a ring like that fails completely, and the block inside it drops. The ring under Pozzuoli is not doing that. I want to be extremely clear about this, because it is the single easiest thing to sensationalize in this entire story, and it would be dishonest to do it. Nothing about this study says the ring is about to fail catastrophically, or that the floor of the caldera is going to drop. What it says is that the shape of the current seismicity is resolving into a ring, and that we can now see where on that ring things are happening. It is worth understanding how a picture like this gets built, because it did not arrive in a single insight. It accumulated. Every earthquake at Campi Flegrei gets located. That means working out from the arrival times of the seismic waves at multiple stations, where in three-dimensional space the rupture began. For a single small event, that location carries real uncertainty, perhaps a few hundred meters in each direction. Plot 1 earthquake and you have learned very little. Plot 100 and you start to see a smudge. Plot tens of thousands, recorded over years by a dense network, and something remarkable happens. The individual uncertainties average out and structure emerges from the noise. That is what has been happening here. The seismicity at this caldera has increased enormously over the past several years, and while that increase is itself a concern, it has had one genuinely useful side effect. It has given researchers the sample size to resolve the shape of the thing. The reason the seismogenic volume is described as becoming increasingly well defined is that the volcano has been supplying the data points to define it, in quantity, month after month. So the ring was not discovered in the sense of being stumbled upon. It was developed, like an image in a darkroom, by an ongoing crisis that kept adding detail. The third finding is the one that made me sit up. Based on geological field experience, the study says, the northern edge has been active for approximately 5,000 years, and in recent times has consistently generated earthquakes aligned along an approximately west-trending direction, extending from the Tiziano and Toiano sector toward the Piana di Agnano. 5,000 years. That is not a feature of the current crisis. That is not something that appeared in 1950 when the modern inflation cycle started, or in 2023 when the seismicity accelerated. The northern boundary of this ring has been a working structure since before the pyramids at Giza were finished. It has been there through the entire recorded history of the region, through the Greek colonists, through the Romans building their villas on the hot ground, through the eruption of 1538, through every one of the modern uplift episodes. And the strongest earthquake ever recorded at this volcano happened on it. Now, here is the part of the study that produces the strangest feeling, and it is genuinely double-edged. Although the latest event is the largest ever recorded, the researchers write, it is consistent with the expectations of the models developed to describe the ongoing evolution of the caldera. The model was not surprised. Read that alongside what Mastro Lorenzo said about the risk being underestimated, and a very specific picture comes into focus. The surprise on the evening of July 31st was a public surprise, not a scientific one. The people who were shocked were the people living on top of it, watching their walls crack, discovering that a volcano they had been told was under control could do this. The models that describe how this caldera evolves had already accounted for an event of this size. That is the gap this entire video is about. It is not a gap between what is known and what is knowable. It is a gap between what is known and what has been communicated, prepared for, and acted on. And notice how that phrase from the title of the study, further confirmation, actually functions. It is the most understated wording imaginable, and it is the language of a field that is careful to the point of self-effacement. But unpack it. Confirmation of what? Of the volcanic system dynamics. Meaning, we had a description of how this system works. We predicted it would produce events of this kind on this structure, and it has now done so. The record-breaking earthquake is being filed as supporting evidence. There are two ways to feel about a model that correctly anticipates the largest earthquake in a volcano's monitored history. The first is reassured, because it means our understanding is sound and the system is not behaving erratically. The second is considerably less comfortable, because a validated model of an escalating process is a model whose other outputs you now have to take more seriously. You do not get to accept the confirmation and reject the framework it confirms. The study then reaches back to work presented at the European Geosciences Union General Assembly in 2026, which found that the seismicity of recent years is distributed along a ring-shaped structure at a depth of between 2 and 4 kilometres. The depth band matters as much as the shape does, and it is worth being concrete about what sits in it. 2 to 4 kilometres is not where magma lives in this system. The magma is deeper. The source of the current unrest is generally placed at 4 to 5 kilometres and below. 2 to 4 kilometres is the zone above that, the region of hot, fluid-saturated, fractured rock that sits between the deep source and the surface, and it is exactly the layer Mastro Lorenzo was describing when he located these earthquakes in a 3-kilometre thick slab of stressed crust. So the ring and the interview are describing the same object from two angles. One says, the earthquakes are happening in a 3-kilometre thick pressurized layer. The other says, within that layer they are arranged on the boundary of an ellipse, and one part of that boundary has been active for 5,000 years, 2 to 4 kilometres, and the July 31st earthquake occurred at approximately 3. It landed in the middle of the depth band, on the boundary that has been active for 5 millennia, in exactly the structure the research had already mapped. Everything about the location of this rupture was, in the technical sense, expected. Which raises a question the study answers in its next sentence, and the answer is the reason I am making this video rather than a shorter one. Because if you have a ring-shaped seismogenic structure at 2 to 4 kilometers depth, sitting above a deeper heat source and below a town, the obvious thing to ask is what that ring is actually for. Not what it is a symptom of, what it does. Part 6. The pathway. At this depth, the study says, the unrest channels magmatic fluids ascending from deeper levels. That is the sentence. I want to walk through it word by word, because every one of them is chosen carefully, and the difference between what it says and what it does not say is enormous. Magmatic fluids, not magma. This is a distinction that gets flattened constantly in coverage of volcanoes, and it genuinely matters. Magma is molten rock. Magmatic fluids are the gases and hot liquids that come out of magma as it sits at depth and decompresses. Carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, water vapor, dissolved and then released as pressure drops. They originate from magma. They are not magma. They can travel through rock that molten material cannot, and they travel far faster, ascending from deeper levels. So the source is below. The study is describing a transfer of material upward from the deep system into the shallower one, and channels. The unrest channels them. The earthquakes and the fracturing are not merely a consequence of the fluids arriving. The fractured ring is the plumbing. It is the root. Then the study goes further, and this is the finding that reorganized how I think about the July 31st event. It demonstrated, they write, that the northern edge acts as a preferential pathway, transferring these fluids toward the central sector of the caldera, Pozzuoli, Solfatara, Picciarelli, where they eventually rise to the surface. Let me lay that out plainly. There is a ring at 2 to 4 kilometers depth. One part of that ring, the northern edge, is not like the rest. It is a preferential pathway, meaning fluids move through it more readily than through the surrounding rock, and it does not lead nowhere. It leads inward and upward toward the central sector, and the central sector is not an abstraction. It is Pozzuoli, where 80,000 people live. It is Solfatara, the crater where you can watch steam come out of the ground, and which is estimated to be the most probable location of a future eruption. It is Picciarelli, the fumarole field on the eastern flank of the Solfatara that has been getting visibly and audibly more energetic for years. Those are the destinations. That is where the material coming up this pathway arrives at the surface. And then the final sentence of that section, the 4.7 occurred precisely along this northern boundary, providing further evidence that this fluid transfer system is currently active. Currently active. Not historically active, not potentially active. The strongest earthquake in the monitored history of this caldera is being read as evidence that the plumbing carrying deep fluids into the ground beneath Pozzuoli is switched on right now. I want to spend a moment on those two destination names, because they are not just labels on a map, and most people watching will never have heard of the second one. The Solfatara is a crater roughly 2,000 years into its own history of continuous low-level activity, and it is the single most famous piece of ground in this caldera. The Romans knew it. It was interpreted in antiquity as an entrance to the underworld, which tells you something about the experience of standing there. The ground is hot. Steam comes out of vents in the rock face. There are mud pools that boil. For most of the modern era, it operated as a tourist attraction, a place you could pay to walk into. Picciarelli sits on the outer eastern flank of the Solfatara, and it is the one to watch. It is a fumarole field, and over recent years it has become progressively more energetic. Hotter, louder, with a mud pool that has migrated and enlarged, and a main vent that roars audibly. Volcanologists monitoring this caldera treat Picciarelli as one of the most informative surface expressions of what the deep system is doing, precisely because it responds quickly. When the pressure downstairs changes, Picciarelli tends to show it before anything else at the surface does. So when the study says the northern edge transfers fluids toward Pozzuoli, the Solfatara and Picciarelli, it is describing a route that terminates at the exact places where this volcano has been visibly, audibly intensifying. The pathway and the symptoms line up. There is one more piece of context worth putting alongside this. Earlier research on this caldera has described the possibility of a well-developed fracture system acting as a shortcut, a route that could assist material moving upward even in circumstances that would not otherwise favour it. The new study does not make that claim, and I am not making it either. But a mapped active preferential pathway running from depth into the shallow system, beneath the most populated part of the caldera, is exactly the kind of structure that earlier work was describing in the abstract. Now I have to do the responsible thing, which is to tell you emphatically what this does not mean, because I have watched this exact kind of finding get mangled into apocalypse content, and I am not going to participate in that. This study does not say an eruption is imminent. It does not say one is coming. It does not say magma is near the surface. It does not contradict the NGV's institutional position that there is no signal of magma moving toward the shallowest levels of the volcano, and it does not argue for raising the alert level. What it says is narrower and, in a way, more useful. Magma is the driver of this unrest. The route by which the deep system communicates with the surface has been mapped, and that route is operating. The distinction I keep returning to is the difference between a car with the engine running and a car in motion. Those are not the same state, but they are also not unrelated states, and if you have been told for years that the vehicle is parked, discovering the engine is running is meaningful information, and there is a consequence of that active pathway which has nothing to do with eruptions at all, and which is already affecting people. Fluids arriving in the shallow subsurface do things. They heat the ground. They raise pore pressure inside the rock, which reduces the friction holding fractures closed and makes it easier for them to slip, which is to say, they make earthquakes more likely, not as a distant consequence but as a direct mechanical one. They chemically attack the rock they pass through, and when they reach the surface they come out as gas into whatever happens to be there. What happens to be there is a town. A tunnel that had to be closed because the gas concentration inside it was unsafe is the pathway's output arriving in a place people use. That is not a warning about the future. That is the present tense, and it was measurable weeks before the record earthquake. So the fluid transfer system being described here is not an abstract plumbing diagram. It is the reason the ground shakes, the reason the fumaroles are getting louder, and the reason a rail line closed. Here is why this connects directly back to the thing Mastro Lorenzo said about not knowing what condition the patient is in. If the earthquakes were purely mechanical, purely the settling and cracking of rock under a slowly inflating dome, then a long record of them would tell you something reasonably reliable about where the process is heading. You could watch the rate, watch the magnitudes, and build a trajectory. But if the seismicity is tracing the movement of magmatic fluids through a pathway, then the earthquakes are reporting on the behavior of a transport system, and transport systems are not smooth. They open, they clog, they redirect. A quiet period might mean less material is moving. It might equally mean the material found an easier route and is moving somewhere the monitoring is less sensitive to, which is precisely what Mastro Lorenzo described when he said the distribution of the earthquakes had changed rather than their intensity. Put the study and the interview side by side, and they are telling the same story from two directions. The scientist says the earthquakes moved and people misread that as calming. The study says the earthquakes are tracing an active fluid pathway. If the pathway shifts, the seismicity shifts, and the reassuring signal that people were reading was not a signal about danger at all. It was a signal about geometry. That is a genuinely difficult thing to build a warning system on, and it takes us to the question that the rest of this video is really about, because there is one more thing the institutional context of this study makes clear, and it destroys the most popular theory about what is going on here. Part 7. What condition is the patient in? The Department of Earth, Environmental and Resource Sciences at the University of Naples. Federico Thecke has been studying the Campi Flegrei unrest and the geological and volcanological evolution of this caldera for many years. The study notes that this is one of the world's most extensively studied and closely monitored volcanic systems, and it gives the reason, the complexity of the system and the high population exposure. I want to pause on that, because it is the fact that makes the central mystery of this story so uncomfortable. This is not a remote volcano in a data-poor part of the world. It is not a peak in the Aleutians with one seismometer and a satellite pass every few days. This caldera sits in a wealthy European country, in a metropolitan area of millions of people, 9 kilometres from a major city, with a dedicated observatory that has been operating since the 19th century. It is instrumented with seismic networks, permanent satellite positioning receivers, measuring ground movement to the millimetre, tilt meters, gravity surveys, and regular geochemical sampling of the fumaroles. It is written about constantly. Multiple universities and international collaborations work on it, and a volcanologist who works on it says we have absolutely no idea what condition this patient is in. That is the collision at the centre of this story. Maximum observation, minimum diagnosis. I have thought about why that is, and the honest answer is not that anyone is failing at their job. It is that monitoring and forecasting are different problems, and we are much better at the first than the second. We can tell you, to the millimetre, how much the ground rose last month. We can tell you the isotopic composition of the gas coming out of the fumaroles. We can locate an earthquake to within a few hundred metres and tell you the orientation of the fault plane that produced it. What we cannot do is take that inventory of measurements and convert it into a position on a timeline, because we do not have enough examples of calderas doing this to know what the timeline looks like. Consider the sample size problem. Campi Flegrei last erupted in 1538. That is a single data point from an era with no instruments, described in contemporary accounts by people who had no framework for what they were seeing. Before that, you're into the geological record, where the dating uncertainty is measured in centuries. Large caldera systems worldwide produce eruptions on timescales of hundreds to thousands of years. Instrumental volcanology is barely a century old. To see how badly that bites, look at the one modern crisis this one can be compared against. In the early 1980s, Campi Flegrei went through a major episode of unrest. The ground rose by something on the order of 2 meters. Thousands of earthquakes were recorded. The historic district of Pozzuoli was evacuated and a substantial population was moved out and rehoused. It was, by every measure available at the time, an emergency. And then it stopped. The uplift reversed. The ground began to subside. The crisis ended without an eruption. That single episode is doing an enormous amount of work in every conversation about this volcano, and it pulls in 2 directions at once. On one hand, it is genuine evidence that a caldera can go through severe unrest and then stand down, which is the strongest available argument that the current situation may resolve the same way. On the other hand, it is one event. You cannot build a base rate from one event, and there is a specific reason the comparison may not hold. The current uplift phase has already carried the ground higher than the 1980s episode did, and unlike that episode, it has not reversed. So the most useful precedent available is a case that ended well, that is also being exceeded by the thing it is supposed to be a precedent for. That is the epistemic situation. It is not comfortable and it does not resolve. So when Mastro Lorenzo says we do not know what stage of the phenomenon's evolution we are experiencing, he is not confessing to a local failure. He is describing a structural limit of the field. He said it precisely. People are often led to believe that the monitoring system can provide us with a reasonably reliable indication of the current level of danger. But we absolutely do not know what stage of the phenomenon's evolution we are currently experiencing. And then the range he gave. We could be very close to even more critical events, or this could be a relatively stable phase in which events such as these continue to occur. Both ends of that range have consequences, and I do not think most coverage has taken the second one seriously enough. Everyone focuses on the first branch because it is the frightening one, close to more critical events. Fine, but look hard at the second, a relatively stable phase in which events such as these continue to occur. Events such as these means magnitude 4 class earthquakes at 3 kilometres depth under a town of degraded masonry. It means 26 injured, 300 displaced, roads blocked, buildings down. The stable scenario is not a good scenario. The stable scenario is this, repeating indefinitely on a building stock that gets weaker each time. There is no version of the next few years in which nothing happens. I think that is the single most underappreciated point in the entire public conversation about this volcano, and it is why the argument people keep having is the wrong argument. The argument people keep having is, will it erupt, yes or no? One side says the risk is being exaggerated and the volcano will do what it has done for centuries, which is rumble and rise and settle. The other side says an eruption is overdue and the authorities are downplaying it. Both sides treat the eruption as the event that determines whether the concern was justified. But the harm is not waiting on the eruption. The harm has already started. It arrived on July 31st in the form of 26 injured people, 2 of them critical, 300 residents out of their homes, and a town with blocked roads and no water. None of that required magma to move a single metre. It required exactly what Mastro Lorenzo calls the stable scenario, events such as these continuing to occur. So when someone says nothing is going to happen at this volcano, the correct response is not to argue about eruption probabilities. It is to point out that something already did. Now let me connect this back to the physical model, because it explains why the diagnosis is so hard. Mastro Lorenzo located these earthquakes in a layer roughly 3 kilometers thick, and identified that layer as the hydrothermal system itself, which expands because of the gases, is placed under stress, and releases that stress through earthquakes such as these. Picture the structure in 3 tiers. At the bottom, at 4 to 5 kilometers and deeper, the heat and the magma. In the middle, a zone of hot, saturated, fractured rock several kilometers thick, taking in gas from below and pressurizing. At the top, a shallower layer of rock that has been repeatedly baked and mineralized by the fluids passing through it, which makes it stronger and less permeable than it would otherwise be. A cap. That cap is why the system can build pressure at all. Without it, the gas would simply vent and nothing would accumulate. With it, pressure rises underneath until the rock fails, and when it fails, you get an earthquake. Here is the trap in that model. Every one of those failures is, in the short term, a pressure release. The system lets go, some fluid escapes upward, the immediate stress drops. That is why an individual earthquake can genuinely be read as the system relieving itself. But every one of those failures also leaves the cap slightly more fractured than it was. So you have a mechanism whose short-term behavior and long-term behavior point in opposite directions. Each earthquake reduces the pressure. Each earthquake weakens the seal. Which of those dominates over years is not something you can read from a monthly bulletin, and it is precisely the thing you would need to know to say what stage of the crisis this is, which is exactly why nobody can say it. There is a further complication that makes the diagnosis harder still, and it concerns what repeated fluid movement does to rock over time. Hot, chemically aggressive fluids passing through fractured rock do not leave it unchanged. They dissolve some minerals and precipitate others, over years that can seal fractures shut, which strengthens the cap and allows more pressure to build. It can also convert strong rock into weak, clay-rich material, which does the opposite. Both processes happen in real hydrothermal systems, often in the same system at different depths, and from the surface you cannot easily tell which is winning where. So the cap is not a fixed object with known properties. It is being actively rebuilt and actively degraded at the same time by the fluids moving through it, on a timescale of years, in a place nobody can go and look. This is the honest reason the monitoring cannot deliver a stage of the crisis. Not because the instruments are poor, they are excellent. Because the quantity that would actually tell you how close this system is to failure is the strength of a few kilometers of chemically evolving rock that no instrument can measure directly, and which is changing while you watch. That is what Mastro Lorenzo is describing when he says we do not know what condition the patient is in. It is not vagueness, it is precision about the limits of the diagnosis. And it leads to a specific scenario that the emergency planning for this volcano is least equipped to handle, and which almost nobody outside the specialist literature talks about. Part 8. The eruption that gives no warning. When people imagine a supervolcano erupting, they imagine the maximum, a caldera forming a vent, ash across a continent, climate consequences, the kind of thing that has its own documentary genre. That is not what we are talking about, and I want to say clearly that I am not suggesting it. The Campanian ignimbrite eruption that helped form this caldera around 40,000 years ago was that kind of event, and it is a scale ceiling rather than a forecast. It is not what the science is pointing at, and it is not what the planners are planning for. The scenario that matters is much smaller, much more likely, and considerably harder to survive if you live on top of it. Campi Flegrei has produced throughout its existence a long series of comparatively small eruptions. The most recent, Monte Nuovo in 1538, built an entire hill in about a week and is described by volcanologists as a small event. Small, in this context, means it did not devastate a region. It also means it produced a new mountain in a populated area, and it was preceded by meters of the same kind of ground uplift that is happening now. The Monte Nuovo event is worth a moment on its own, because it is the only eruption here that anybody actually watched and wrote down, and the description of what preceded it should sound familiar. The years before it were characterized by ground uplift on a scale that is genuinely difficult to imagine. Meters of it, enough that the shoreline moved and new land appeared where there had been sea. There were earthquakes. The town of Pozzuoli, which was there then as it is now, was progressively damaged, and people left. Then, over a period of about a week in 1538, a new vent opened and built a hill roughly 130 meters high out of ejected material. It is still there. You can walk up it. That is what a small eruption at Campi Flegrei looks like, a mountain appearing inside a town over the course of a week. Volcanologists classify it as minor because of the volume of material and the limited distance the effects travelled. For anyone living within a kilometre of the vent, the classification would have been academic. The reason this matters for today is the shape of the sequence. Uplift over years, escalating earthquakes, progressive structural damage, population displacement, and then an eruption. The current crisis has the first four. That does not mean the fifth is coming. The 1980s crisis had several of the same elements and ended without one. But it does mean the pattern being observed now is not unrecognisable. It has a precedent, and the precedent is local. Among that series of smaller events, the system has also produced phreatic eruptions. A phreatic eruption is a steam explosion. There is no fresh magma reaching the surface at all. What happens is that groundwater or hydrothermal fluid, trapped underground and held at high temperature under pressure, is suddenly decompressed. Perhaps a fracture opens. Perhaps a section of the sealing rock fails. The superheated water flashes instantly to steam, expanding by a factor of well over 1,000, and the rock above it is blown out as a projectile-laden blast of steam, mud, and fragmented material. Consider the physics for a second, because the numbers explain why something so unglamorous is so lethal. Water held under pressure underground can be far hotter than the boiling point you're familiar with, because pressure suppresses boiling. Remove that pressure suddenly, and the water does not gently begin to steam. It flashes. A given volume of liquid water becomes over 1,000 times that volume of vapour, essentially instantaneously. Everything sitting above it becomes shrapnel. There is no molten rock involved. There is no magma chamber emptying. The entire event is powered by hot water finding out it is no longer under pressure. The reference case that most people will recognise is White Island in New Zealand in 2019, where a steam-driven eruption killed 22 people who were standing on the volcano at the time. The characteristic that makes phreatic activity so dangerous is not its size. By volcanic standards, these events are minor. It is the warning time. A magmatic eruption has to move molten rock through several kilometres of crust, and that process announces itself. Magma fractures rock as it ascends, which produces distinctive earthquake sequences that migrate upward over time. It deforms the ground above it. It changes the gas chemistry. Those precursors can unfold over days or weeks, which is what emergency planning is built around. A phreatic eruption requires none of that, because nothing needs to ascend. All the energy is already in place, stored as pressurized hot water in rock that is already there. The trigger is a failure of confinement, and that failure can be caused by, among other things, an earthquake. That is the sentence I want to leave with you, and it is why this scenario belongs in this video rather than a different one. In a system where the shallow rock is repeatedly fractured by magnitude 4 class earthquakes, the earthquakes themselves are a plausible trigger for the kind of eruption that arrives without notice. Work the logic through slowly, because each step is individually uncontroversial, and the destination is not. Step 1. This system contains large volumes of hot fluid held under pressure in the shallow subsurface. That is not speculative. It is the mechanism the earthquakes are attributed to, and it is why the fumaroles exist. Step 2. That fluid is confined by a layer of rock above it. Again, not speculative. Without confinement, there would be no pressure to release and no earthquakes. Step 3. The confinement is repeatedly failing. Every magnitude 4 class event in this crisis is a failure of confinement on a structure now identified as a preferential pathway for exactly these fluids. Step 4. A sufficiently rapid, sufficiently large failure of confinement is the definition of a phreatic eruption. That chain does not prove anything is going to happen. Most confinement failures are small, most of them relieve pressure gradually, and this system has been failing in this manner for years without producing a steam explosion. But the chain does show that the phreatic scenario is not an exotic add-on to the current situation. It is the same process the volcano is already running at a different magnitude. Now hold that against the geography. The Solfatara crater is the estimated most likely location of a future eruption. The Solfatara crater is where the July 31st epicenter was. The Picciarelli fumarole field sits on its flank, and people live around all of it, in a town, with schools and shops and apartment buildings, because the caldera is spread out and there was never an obvious line to build up to. An event that would be a footnote in an uninhabited volcanic field is a mass casualty incident here, purely because of where the houses are. I want to be careful not to overstate this, so let me be exact. There is no current indication that a phreatic eruption is about to occur at Campi Flegrei. The alert level has not moved. The institutional position is that there is no shallow magma movement. I am not predicting a steam eruption, and neither is anyone quoted in this video. What I am telling you is that this specific scenario exists, that this specific volcano has produced it before, that the trigger for it is the thing that is currently happening every few weeks, and that it does not give you 3 days to get out. Remember that number, 3 days, because the entire official protection plan for roughly 500,000 people is built on it, and we're about to look at that plan in detail. But first, there is a scientist who has been saying all of this in public for years, using a phrase that has followed him around ever since, and what he actually means by it is more specific than it sounds. Part 9. Rolling the Dice. Giuseppe Di Natale is a research director at the NGV. He has spent a very long career on this caldera, and when he speaks to the press about it, he does so in a personal capacity, which is a small procedural detail that carries a great deal of weight. It means the things he says are not the institution's position. It means he has chosen to say them anyway. The phrase that has followed him for years is short enough to fit on a placard. We are rolling the dice. I want to be careful with that phrase, because on the surface it sounds like exactly the sort of thing a critic would say to generate a headline, and if that is all it is, then it does not deserve much of your attention. But it is not a statement about the volcano. Read in context, it is a statement about a decision, and the decision is not being made by the volcano. What Di Natale means is this. Nobody can quantify the probability of an eruption here in any way that would satisfy a statistician, because as we have established at some length, nobody can identify what stage of the process this is. In that situation, you have a choice about how to act. You can act as though the low probability outcomes will not occur and accept the exposure that comes with that. Or you can prepare for the range, including the parts of the range you consider unlikely. Italy has chosen the first option, not through a single decision that anyone announced, but through a long accumulation of individually reasonable choices about building permits, tourism development, plan updates deferred, and states of emergency not declared. Rolling the dice is a description of that posture. His actual position, stated repeatedly, is not that an eruption is coming. It is that we have to prepare for every possible scenario, not only a larger earthquake, but also an eruption. And he is explicit that the probability of the catastrophic outcome is low in the short term, while adding the thing that everybody skips. All catastrophic events are by definition unlikely. That is what makes them catastrophic events rather than ordinary ones. Designing a public safety system around the assumption that unlikely things will not happen is the single most common failure mode in disaster planning, because unlikely things happen constantly. There are simply a great many of them. He has also said on the record that he has called for evacuations, not permanent relocation of a metropolitan area, which would be absurd and which he does not propose. Temporary movement of the population living in the most seismically exposed positions, out of the buildings least likely to survive during the period of highest activity, and he has said he would have done it in 2023. That date is worth dwelling on, because it was not chosen arbitrarily. 2023 is when the seismicity at this caldera stepped up sharply, a year in which the recorded event counts climbed dramatically over what had come before, and in which researchers began describing the system in language that had not been used previously. It is also the year in which, as Mastro Lorenzo mentioned, a rapid emergency plan was drawn up specifically for the restricted red zone because of concerns about exactly this class of event. So 2023 was not a quiet year that Di Natale is retrospectively assigning significance to. It was the year the institutional apparatus itself registered that something had changed, produced a document about it, and then did not act on the document. There is a second element to his criticism that gets less attention and cuts deeper. He has pointed out that in 1970 and again in 1984, Italian governments did evacuate this area during periods of unrest. Those were poorer governments, with worse instrumentation, less scientific understanding, and fewer resources than exist today. They looked at a rising, shaking piece of ground with people on it, and they moved the people. Today there is more monitoring, more data, more published research, more money, and considerably more precise knowledge of what the ground is doing, and there has been less action. He has also made a point about what he calls attractors, and it is an uncomfortable observation about how modern economies interact with hazard. Major events, tourism and property development function as forces pulling people toward this area rather than away from it, which steadily increases the number of people exposed. Meanwhile, the closures and disruptions caused by the Brady Schism itself, the tunnels, the port, the roads, degrade the routes out. Exposure rises while egress falls. Those two curves are moving in opposite directions, and they have been for years. A final piece of his position deserves stating, because it is the part most easily lost. He warns explicitly against reading short-term fluctuation as improvement. A quieter month is not a trend. Given what we now know about the seismicity redistributing rather than declining, that warning was more precisely correct than it probably sounded at the time. Now here is the piece of this that I think most coverage has handled badly, and it concerns a specific number. De Natal has said that a magnitude 5 is possible. That statement has been treated in some quarters as alarmism, and I want to look at it properly, because it is more defensible than it appears and more limited than it sounds. Published modelling on this caldera has placed an expected maximum earthquake magnitude in the region of moment magnitude 4.4, with the higher end of the range requiring several fault structures to activate at the same time. The July 31st event, remember, came out at approximately 4.2 on that same moment scale, while setting an all-time record of 4.7 on the duration scale. So a magnitude 5 is above the modelled expectation. It is not, however, off the map. Model ceilings on maximum earthquake size are estimates derived from the dimensions of the structures available to rupture and the strength of the rock, and they carry uncertainty in both inputs. A system that has just produced its largest ever recorded event, on a structure that researchers have only recently resolved, is not a system where you should be confident about the ceiling to one decimal place. The reason this specific number matters so much is not seismological. It is architectural. Because the Italian Minister for Civil Protection said, publicly, last year, that if a magnitude 5 occurs, we will count the dead. That is a serving minister with responsibility for disaster response, stating in advance that a specific magnitude of earthquake in this area will produce fatalities, not might, will. He got significant backlash for saying it, and the backlash reportedly came from directions you can probably guess: tourism interests and property development, which is its own kind of tell. The minister's assessment was not a solo opinion either. Structural engineers who have lived through magnitude 5 earthquakes in Naples and in Rome, in areas with the same category of housing stock, have backed it up. Their assessment is that hundreds of thousands of people are exposed, and their explanation for why is the same one we walked through earlier. Old masonry buildings whose mortar has degraded to the point where they are essentially leaning on each other, holding themselves up through friction and mutual support rather than through the strength of the bond between the bricks. Take that seriously for a moment, because it reframes the entire hazard. The dangerous thing at Campi Flegrei, on the most probable timeline, is not lava. It is not a pyroclastic flow. It is not ash burying a city. It is a magnitude 5 earthquake at 3 kilometres depth, arriving under a district of 19th and 20th century masonry that has already absorbed a run of magnitude 4 class shaking over the past year and a half. You do not need the volcano to erupt to get that. You need the volcano to keep doing precisely what it is doing. And on July 31st, a magnitude 4.7, well below the minister's stated threshold, put 26 people in hospital, 2 of them critically, and 300 out of their homes. That was the practice run. So when De Natal says we are rolling the dice are not a metaphor for eruption probability. They are a description of leaving a large population inside structures that a foreseeable, already anticipated earthquake will bring down, while the ground underneath continues to rise and the gas output continues to climb. The obvious question is why nobody acted on that, and the answer to that question is on the record in a single quoted sentence, and it is genuinely one of the more remarkable admissions I have come across in this line of work. Part 10. I was told it would create problems. The sentence comes to us second hand, and I want to be upfront about that, because the provenance matters. Mastro Lorenzo, in his post-earthquake interview, was asked about the adequacy of the emergency planning. In the course of answering, he described something the Minister for Civil Protection had said the previous year, and he prefaced it by noting he did not remember the exact words. Here is his account. It is paradoxical, he said, that just last year the Minister for Civil Protection said something along the lines of, I intended and believed it was appropriate, I do not remember the exact words, to declare a state of emergency, but I was told that it would create problems for the economy, tourism, and so on. Read that again slowly. A serving minister with direct responsibility for civil protection formed the professional judgment that a state of emergency was warranted for this area. He did not act on that judgment, and the reason given, in his own recounting, was not that the science did not support it, or that the risk assessment came back negative, or that the resources were unavailable. The reason was that declaring it would create problems for the economy and for tourism. I have thought about how to characterize this without overstating it, and I keep arriving at the same place. This is not a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories are things people infer from an absence of information. This is the opposite. It is a description, sourced to the official himself, of a risk decision being overridden by a commercial consideration, recounted publicly by a scientist who then said what he thought about it. What he thought about it was this. In my opinion, that is the real problem here. There needs to be greater clarity. The information provided must be more accurate, and unfortunately, difficult decisions have to be made. It is worth spelling out what a state of emergency would actually have done, because in ordinary usage the phrase sounds like a siren going off, and it is not that at all. In the Italian system, a declared state of emergency is primarily an administrative and financial instrument. It unlocks funding streams. It allows procurement to bypass normal timelines. It gives civil protection authorities powers they do not otherwise have to direct resources, to commission structural surveys, to requisition accommodation, and to move people out of buildings assessed as unsafe without waiting for the usual processes. In other words, the thing that was not declared is the thing that would have paid for the structural assessment of the masonry, and would have provided the legal mechanism to temporarily rehouse the people living in the worst of it. The reason that matters is that it converts an abstract argument about risk communication into a concrete causal chain. No declaration meant no emergency funding. No emergency funding meant no accelerated survey of vulnerable buildings. No survey meant nobody knew which specific structures would fail, and on July 31st some of them did, with people inside them, and 26 of those people were injured. I am not claiming that a declaration in 2025 would have prevented every one of those injuries. Nobody can claim that. What I am saying is that the decision not to declare was not a neutral act of caution. It had consequences that ran in one direction, and the direction was toward the outcome that occurred. That last clause is the whole thing. Difficult decisions have to be made. Every part of this story that has gone wrong at the point where a difficult decision was available and a comfortable one was taken instead. And then Mastro Lorenzo said the part that will stay with me longest, because it is a counterfactual, and counterfactuals in disaster reporting are usually cheap. This one is not. Had a state of emergency been declared, he said, and had at least the people living in the area most exposed to seismic risk been temporarily moved away, not permanently relocated to other regions, but temporarily evacuated, people's lives would not have been placed at risk. He is not describing an evacuation of Naples. He is describing moving the residents of the most vulnerable buildings in the most exposed positions out of those buildings for a period. That is a policy that could have been executed. It has been executed here before, in the 1980s, when the historic centre of Pozzuoli was cleared and a substantial population was rehoused. The infrastructure of thought for doing this exists in Italian civil protection because Italy has done it at this exact volcano within living memory. Then he noted the outcome. Over 20 people were injured. This is the first time that injuries have been reported, including some serious injuries, and the consequences could have been much worse. He is right that they could have been. The buildings that collapsed completely were, by every account, uninhabited at the time. That was luck. It was not planning, it was not mitigation, and it is not a resource you can allocate. Now let me deal properly with the theory that follows naturally from all of this, because a lot of people watching will already have arrived at it, and it deserves a real answer rather than a dismissal. The theory is that the authorities are concealing the true level of risk at Campi Flegrei in order to protect tourism revenue and property values. Here is what supports it. A minister has described being told a state of emergency would create economic and tourism problems. Development inside the exposed zone has expanded rather than contracted over the period when volcanologists were asking for the opposite. There were reports of a hotel planned in Pozzuoli near the Solfatara, which is to say, near the fumarole field, in the area estimated to be the most likely location of a future eruption. and the minister who warned publicly about counting the dead received backlash connected to those same interests. That is not nothing. That is a documented pattern of commercial pressure operating on public safety decisions, and anyone who waves it away is not being serious. Here is what does not support the theory, and it is decisive on the specific question of concealment. The NGV publishes. It publishes constantly. Every earthquake at this caldera gets a public event page with the location, the depth, the magnitude, the timing, and the technical parameters of the solution. Monthly bulletins go out describing the deformation. The gas chemistry gets reported. And critically, the most alarming assessments of this volcano that exist anywhere. The papers arguing the caldera has entered a regime where rock is permanently breaking rather than elastically flexing. The work on the growing fault structure beneath Pozzuoli, the modelling of the magma budget, are published in open-access journals and co-authored by INGV's own scientists. An institution running a cover-up does not publish the cover-up. I want to press on this a little further because it is the single most useful thing I can give you for evaluating any claim about this volcano from now on. If you want to know what the scientists actually think, you do not need to interpret a press conference or read between the lines of an official statement. You can read the papers. They are open access. They contain sentences that are considerably more alarming than anything the institution has said publicly. Descriptions of a caldera that has moved into a regime where rock is permanently breaking rather than elastically flexing. Assessments that the accumulated pressure of recent years exceeds the tensile strength of the crust above it. Analyses of a fault structure growing beneath the town. Those sentences were written by INGV scientists and published under their names. They are on the internet right now. The information is not being suppressed. It is being ignored, which is a completely different failure and requires no villain at all. That distinction matters for how you respond to it. If information is being suppressed, the remedy is exposure. Find the hidden thing, publish it, and the problem is addressed. If information is freely available and simply is not driving decisions, exposure achieves nothing because there is nothing to expose. The remedy has to be political, and political remedies require somebody to accept a cost. Which brings us back to the minister and the reason he gave, and the fact that the cost in question was measured in tourism and property values. So the honest conclusion is not that there is a conspiracy. It is something that I would argue is worse, precisely because it is so ordinary. What is happening at Campi Flegrei is an institutional conflict of interest combined with a communication failure. The science is public and it is alarming. The decisions are political, and they are shaped by the economic consequences of acting on that science. And the gap between those two things has been filled, for years, by silence, by reassurance, and by the absence of any authority willing to say plainly to the people living there what the published literature has been saying about the ground under their houses. A conspiracy would at least be interesting. This is just the normal way risk gets managed when acting on it is expensive, and it is the normal way because it works, right up until the point that it does not, which in this case was 46 minutes past 7 on the evening of July 31st. And the physical evidence for that failure is not hidden in a report. It is drawn on a map, and the map has been getting bigger. Part 11. The Zone That Grew. There is a red zone at Campi Flegrei. That is the designated area from which the entire population is expected to leave in the event that an alarm is declared. Roughly 500,000 people live inside it. Hold that figure for a second, because the scale is easy to skate over. 500,000 people is a large city. It is more people than live in Atlanta, or Manchester, or Bologna. It is not a village that needs evacuating. It is a metropolitan population that occupies a red zone drawn around an active volcanic system, and every one of them is inside the boundary because somebody, at some point, decided the boundary had to go there. For years, some volcanologists have argued that the population of the Naples metropolitan area should be reduced, and that construction on the caldera should be restricted. This was not a fringe position, and it was not new. The reasoning is simple enough that it does not require a specialist to follow. If you cannot reduce the hazard, and you cannot predict the hazard, then the only variable left that you actually control is how many people are standing in it. Development moved in the opposite direction. Pozzuoli expanded, Boccoli expanded, Quarto expanded, Giuliano expanded, other municipalities in the most exposed area expanded as well, and the zone considered most exposed now reaches into Naples neighbourhoods, Posillipo, Fuorigrotta and Bagnoli. I want to be fair about why, because sneering at this misses the point entirely. This is one of the most beautiful coastal areas in Europe. The bay is spectacular, the climate is superb, the archaeology is extraordinary, the ground is geothermally warm. People have wanted to live there continuously for over 2,500 years, which is a track record that no risk assessment is going to overturn on its own. Add ordinary housing pressure in a large metropolitan area, add a construction sector that needs to build somewhere. Add the fact that the volcano has not erupted since 1538 and is therefore not part of anybody's lived experience, and you get exactly what happened. Not a decision to put people in danger, an absence of any decision to stop. There is also a specific economic mechanism that keeps this going, and it is worth naming because it explains why the pressure runs the way it does. Consider the position of anyone who owns property inside the red zone. The value of that property depends on a shared understanding that the area is a normal place to live. A state of emergency, a formal downgrade of the area's safety status, a widely publicised structural survey identifying which buildings will not survive a magnitude 5, any of those would damage that value, immediately and substantially, not for a speculator, for ordinary households whose entire net worth is the apartment they live in. So the constituency opposing a frank public assessment of the risk is not a small group of hoteliers. It includes a large fraction of the people who would be protected by that assessment. They are, in a real sense, being asked to accept a certain financial loss today in exchange for a reduction in an unquantifiable probability of harm at an unknown future date. Framed that way, the political outcome stops being surprising. It becomes close to inevitable, and it explains the shape of the backlash the minister received when he said that a magnitude 5 would mean counting the dead. That was a statement which, entirely accurately, made the area sound like a dangerous place to buy a house. How do you even advertise a property there? It comes with a view. It comes with excellent geothermal heating. The honest version of the listing is not something an estate agent can write, and the dishonest version is what everybody has settled for. But the arithmetic does not care about the reasons. Every additional apartment block inside the red zone adds to the number of people who have to be moved in 72 hours along the same roads. Every additional resident makes the plan harder to execute. And unlike almost every other variable in this story, this one is entirely within human control and moved steadily in the wrong direction, while the scientists who study the volcano asked, publicly and repeatedly, for the opposite. It also has a second-order effect that is easy to miss. New construction in an exposed zone does not only add people, it adds political weight on the side of not disrupting the area. Each new development creates owners, mortgages, businesses and jobs that depend on the zone continuing to be treated as normal. So the expansion does not merely increase the number of people who would need to be evacuated. It increases the resistance to any measure that would acknowledge why they might need to be. That is a feedback loop, and it runs in one direction only. More building means more exposure and more opposition to admitting the exposure, which makes restriction harder, which permits more building. There is a comparison worth making here, and it clarifies what is genuinely unusual about this situation. Yellowstone is the caldera system everybody has heard of, and it is monitored intensively for the same reason, because it is large, active, and capable of extraordinary events. But Yellowstone is a national park. Its population, on the busiest summer day, is visitors, and visitors can be turned around at a gate. Nobody's family home sits on the resurgent dome. Campi Flegrei has roughly 500,000 permanent residents inside its designated evacuation zone. That is the difference, and it is not a difference of degree. Every other question about this volcano, how fast it is deforming, how much gas it is emitting, where the earthquakes are occurring, matters primarily because of that one number. There is a further wrinkle in this, and it is one of those details that seems minor until you think about who it affects. Preparedness between municipalities inside the red zone is uneven. Pozzuoli, which has borne the brunt of the crisis and has the most direct experience of it, appears to be better prepared. Other municipalities in the same red zone have not completed the same work, and in some cases sections of their official websites, the places where a resident would go to find out where they are supposed to report in an emergency and which region they would be relocated to, reportedly still contain unfinished placeholders. Text along the lines of text to be inserted. Test text. Sit with what that means in practice. A resident of one of those municipalities, watching the news on the evening of July 31st with their windows rattling, goes online to check what they are supposed to do. and what they find is a template that nobody has filled in. That is not a hypothetical failure that would only matter during an eruption. That is a person, on the night of the largest earthquake ever recorded at this volcano, being unable to find out what the plan for them is, because the plan for them has not been written down. The plan those pages are supposed to describe does exist at the national level, and it has a specific structure worth knowing. It was updated in 2019, and it provides for thousands of families to be relocated across Italy to designated partner regions and autonomous provinces for those who do not have relatives or friends able to take them in. Each municipality inside the red zone is twinned with a destination somewhere else in the country. That is the architecture. Not a mass movement to a field outside town, but a distributed national resettlement, coordinated in advance, with each community assigned a place to go. It is, on paper, a serious piece of planning. It reflects a genuine institutional understanding that this population cannot simply be moved a few kilometres, because a few kilometres is still inside the hazard, and its entire value depends on the affected person knowing which region they are twinned with before the emergency starts, not during it. That is the single piece of information the placeholder pages were supposed to carry. There is one more thing about the 2019 update that should give you pause. The plan was written before the seismicity stepped up in 2023, before the uplift reached its current cumulative total, before the gas flux climbed to the point of closing a tunnel, and before the caldera produced the 4 magnitude 4 class earthquakes that have followed. The document that governs how 500,000 people would be moved was drafted for a version of this volcano that was measurably less active than the one that exists now. I do not raise that to suggest the plan is worthless. Much of it would still function. I raise it because a plan is a snapshot of a hazard at the moment somebody wrote it down, and this hazard has moved. And this connects directly back to the thing that makes this entire situation so difficult. If you knew what stage of the crisis you were in, you could sequence the work. You could say, we have this many years, so we complete the municipal plans by this date, restrict construction from this date, and begin the structural survey of vulnerable buildings on this schedule. The unknowability that Mastro Lorenzo described is not just a scientific problem, it removes the deadline, and work without a deadline in any institution anywhere in the world is work that does not get finished. So the red zone grew, the plan stayed unfinished, and the whole structure came to rest on a single assumption that has never been tested, that when the moment comes, there will be enough time. It is worth finding out whether that assumption survives contact with the actual geography, because there is a number attached to it, and the number is 72 hours. Part 12. 72 hours. The national plan allows 72 hours for evacuation. That is the number everything rests on, and it breaks down into 3 components. 12 hours for preparation, 48 hours for a staggered departure from the red zone, and a further 12 hours held back as a safety margin. It is a considered structure. The 12 hours of preparation exist because you cannot simply tell 500,000 people to leave at once. You need to activate the assembly points, stage the transport, notify the receiving regions, and get the message out. The 48 hours of staggered departure exist because releasing everybody onto the road network simultaneously would produce gridlock, so the population leaves in sequence by area, according to a schedule. The final 12 hours are slack because plans overrun. The trigger is the declaration of an alarm. Once that alarm is declared, the entire population of the red zone must leave, either independently or with assistance. Now let us look at what that requires in the physical world. The practical question, as posed by the local scientists and by residents themselves, is not an abstraction about probabilities. It is this: how much time would there actually be to move nearly 1 million people to safety along these roads? 1 million, rather than the 500,000 inside the red zone, because the red zone boundary is a line on a map, and human behaviour does not respect lines on maps. The Greater Naples area holds around 3 million people. The wider metropolitan region reaches up to 6 million. If an eruption alarm is declared for Campi Flegrei, the proposition that only the people inside the designated boundary will attempt to leave is, to put it gently, optimistic. Everybody in the surrounding city will have seen the same news. Many will have family inside the zone. A substantial number will simply decide, reasonably, that they would rather be somewhere else. The staggered departure schedule assumes an orderly, sequenced flow. What it would actually encounter is the ordered flow, plus an unscheduled outflow, from a city of 1 million people around it, converging on the same motorway junctions. It is worth doing the arithmetic explicitly, because the 72-hour figure sounds generous until you convert it into vehicles. Take the red zone population alone, 500,000 people. Assume, generously, an average of 3 people per vehicle, which is higher than most real evacuations achieve because families fragment and people take 2 cars. That is roughly 160,000 vehicles. Spread across the 48 hours of staggered departure, that is a sustained flow of around 3,500 vehicles per hour, continuously, day and night, for 2 days, through a road network whose exit routes number in the low single digits. Those are not implausible numbers for a motorway operating at capacity. They are extremely implausible numbers for a network that begins with narrow, parked-up streets, feeding into a small number of arteries in a city that already experiences serious congestion on an ordinary Tuesday. And that calculation assumes the ideal case. It assumes everyone leaves in their assigned window. It assumes no unscheduled outflow from the surrounding metropolitan area. It assumes every vehicle starts, every road is clear and nobody stops. Change any one of those assumptions and the flow rate required goes up while the capacity available goes down. Then there are the roads themselves. Much of the road network inside the caldera is old. The streets in the historic parts of Pozzuoli and the surrounding towns were laid out long before anyone was thinking about vehicular evacuation, and they are narrow and winding. Both sides are lined with parked cars because in a dense coastal town with limited off-street parking, there is nowhere else to put a vehicle. The effective width available for movement is often a single lane, and we already know what happens to those roads when this volcano produces a moderate earthquake, because it did it on July 31st. Collapsed buildings across the carriageway, boulders in the road, crushed and abandoned cars. The routes out were physically blocked by a magnitude 4.7, which is an event well below the worst case that the plan is designed for. That is the flaw sitting at the centre of the 72-hour architecture, and it is not subtle once you see it. The scenario in which you most need to evacuate is a scenario preceded by, or accompanied by, exactly the kind of shaking that closes the roads you would evacuate along. The plan needs the road network to be intact at the moment it is activated, and the hazard it is protecting against is one of the few things capable of guaranteeing it will not be. There is an anecdote that demonstrates this better than any model could, and it comes from last year. During a magnitude 4.6 event, some of the INGV leadership were reportedly unable to reach their own offices located in the epicentral area, because the roads were blocked. Follow the implication all the way through. The people whose professional responsibility is to monitor this volcano, who would be the source of the technical advice on which an evacuation decision depends, could not physically get to their workplace because a moderate earthquake had closed the roads between them and it. If the monitors cannot get in, what exactly is the mechanism by which 500,000 residents get out? There is something else about that anecdote worth extracting, because it is not only about roads. An evacuation of this scale is not a single decision made once. It is a continuous stream of decisions made under deteriorating conditions over 3 days. When to release each area, whether to hold or accelerate the schedule, how to respond when a route closes, whether the situation has changed enough to compress the timetable. Every one of those decisions requires current technical assessment of what the volcano is doing, and that assessment comes from people who need to be at instruments, in communication with each other, with power and data links working. Those people are inside the hazard zone. Their offices are inside the hazard zone. The event that triggers the evacuation is the same event that degrades their ability to function. Most catastrophic failures of complex systems have this shape. The mechanism that is supposed to manage the emergency is itself damaged by the emergency, and the damage arrives first. There is a further problem with the 72-hour figure that we have already touched on, and that I want to make explicit here, because this is where it lands. 72 hours is a warning time. Warning times come from precursors. Precursors come from a process that announces itself in advance. Magma ascending, fracturing rock as it goes, deforming the surface, changing the gas chemistry over days and weeks. A steam-driven eruption does not do that. The energy is already in place. The trigger is a failure of confinement, and one plausible trigger for a failure of confinement is an earthquake, which is a thing this volcano now does regularly. So the plan requires 72 hours. The scenario that most plausibly kills people here does not necessarily provide 72 minutes. I should be careful and fair about the last piece of this, because it is the piece with the weakest sourcing and the strongest emotional charge. In the aftermath of July 31st, there has been considerable public criticism of the response. Residents describing nobody being present, being left alone, having no water for hours, reception areas that were not adequate. I want to be clear about what that is and is not. It is aggregated local sentiment, expressed across a large volume of public comment, and it is not a verified institutional finding. I cannot tell you whether every individual account is accurate, and neither can anyone else at this distance. What I can tell you is that it is not a handful of isolated complaints. It is a pattern, and it is consistent, and the people expressing it are the same people who have spent the last 2 years being told the situation is under control. That last point is the one that will matter longest, and it is not about logistics at all. Every emergency plan in the world runs on public compliance. The 72-hour schedule only works if, when the alarm sounds, people believe it and move in the order they are told to move in. That belief is a resource. It is accumulated slowly, through consistent and honest communication, and it is spent very quickly by any episode in which the public concludes they were not told the truth. Consider what has been spent here. A minister who says a magnitude 5 will mean counting the dead, and then says he was told a state of emergency would create problems for tourism. Municipal plans with placeholder text where the instructions should be. A quiet period presented as improvement that turned out to be a redistribution. Scientists on the record saying the risk was underestimated, and, on the night itself, a widespread perception that nobody came. You cannot run a staggered 48-hour departure with a population that does not trust the people telling them when to leave. They will not wait for their scheduled window. They will go immediately all at once onto a road network that a moderate earthquake can close. The plan assumes 72 hours and it assumes order. On the evening of July 31st, this volcano quietly demonstrated that it can take away the second one without even trying. Part 13. The patient on the table. Let me put the whole thing back together, because the pieces only mean something in combination. On the evening of July 31st, 2026, the Campi Flegrei caldera produced the strongest earthquake ever recorded there since systematic instrumental monitoring began. Magnitude 4.7 at approximately 3 kilometres depth, beneath one of the most densely populated volcanic fields on Earth. 26 people were injured, 5 went to hospital, 2 are critical. A man was pulled out from under a boulder that landed on his car. Around 300 people cannot go home. Buildings came down, the port closed, the rail network stopped, the water and the power went out, and the roads that people would use to leave were blocked by the rubble of the buildings they were leaving. The alert level did not change. A study released within hours placed that rupture on the northern edge of a seismogenic ring at 2 to 4 kilometres depth, a structure that has been active for 5,000 years and that acts as a preferential pathway carrying magmatic fluids upward toward Pozzuoli, the Solfatara and Picciarelli. The record earthquake is read as further evidence that this transfer system is currently active, and the model that describes how this caldera evolves was not surprised by any of it. The ground is still rising, roughly a centimetre a month. The gas output has increased sharply enough to close a rail tunnel. The seismicity did not decline in the months before the record. It moved, and people mistook the movement for a decline. And the scientists who work on this system say plainly that they do not know what stage of the process they are looking at. Not that they are uncertain within a range, that the range spans from a stable phase to being very close to more critical events, and they cannot tell you which end of it we're standing on. Meanwhile, 500,000 people live inside the red zone. The zone has grown rather than shrunk. Some municipal emergency pages still contain placeholder text. The national plan needs 72 hours, an intact road network, and a compliant population, and July 31st put a question mark over at least 2 of those 3. Here is what I keep coming back to. The mystery at Campi Flegrei is not whether it will erupt. That question gets all the attention, and it is, in a practical sense, the least useful question available, because nobody can answer it and the harm is not waiting for the answer. The harm is already arriving, in the form of moderate earthquakes on fragile buildings full of people, and it will keep arriving under every scenario the scientists consider plausible, including the ones they call stable. The actual mystery is why, knowing that the timeline is unknowable, the response was to leave 500,000 people on top of it, with an unfinished plan and a warning requirement the volcano has never agreed to. Mastro Lorenzo called it a patient whose condition we cannot determine. I think that metaphor is more exact than he perhaps intended because of what it implies about the people standing around the bed. When you genuinely cannot tell whether a patient is stable or deteriorating, you do not send everyone home and wait to find out. You monitor and you prepare for the worst branch, precisely because you cannot rule it out. There is a version of this story that I want to give proper weight to before finishing, because I do not think anyone watching should leave with the impression that the people responsible for this volcano are negligent or indifferent. Overwhelmingly, they are not. The INGV runs one of the best volcano monitoring operations in the world on this caldera. The Vesuvius Observatory has been at this since the 1840s, which makes it the oldest institution of its kind anywhere. The scientists working there are, by any reasonable measure, doing their jobs extremely well. They locate every earthquake, publish every bulletin, sample the fumaroles, and put their most uncomfortable conclusions into the open literature under their own names. The problem is not the people at the bottom of the system. It is that the output of all that excellent work has to pass through a decision layer that operates on completely different incentives, and at that layer the calculation is not about probability of failure. It is about the political and economic cost of acting on a probability nobody can pin down. That is why I do not think this is a story about Italy, particularly, and I want to say so plainly. Substitute any comparably exposed hazard in any comparably developed country, and the pattern is recognizable. The science gets done, the papers get published, the plans get written and then partially updated. The population grows in the exposed zone because the exposed zone is desirable, and the difficult decision keeps getting deferred, entirely rationally, by each individual decision maker in turn, until an event arrives that makes the deferral visible. On July 31st, the deferral became visible. 26 times over. What happened here instead is that the uncertainty was read as permission. Not knowing whether things were getting worse was treated, in practice, as a reason to behave as though they were not. That is the failure. It is not a scientific failure, because the science has been published openly in journals anybody can read, by researchers who put their names on conclusions considerably more alarming than anything the institutions have said out loud. It is not a monitoring failure, because the instruments are excellent and the data is good. It is a failure to convert knowledge into action, which is the most ordinary failure there is, and the one that repeats most reliably. Before we finish, I want to address the people who arrive in the comments under every video I make about this volcano to say that this is fear-mongering, that I've been reporting on Campi Flegrei for years, and that nothing is going to happen. I understand the instinct, genuinely. There is a whole ecosystem online that manufactures dread for clicks, and healthy skepticism toward anyone talking about supervolcanoes is a reasonable default. If that is where you're coming from, you are not wrong to be skeptical, and I would rather have skeptical viewers than credulous ones. But I want to be specific about what is actually being claimed here, because the objection usually responds to something I have not said. I am not saying an eruption is coming. Nobody quoted in this video is saying that. The institutional position is that there is no signal of magma moving toward the shallow system, and I have repeated that position several times because it is important and it is probably correct. What I am reporting is what the scientists who instrument this volcano have said on the record, what a study published within hours of the earthquake concluded about where the rupture occurred, and what happened to 26 people on the evening of July 31st. None of that is invention. It is not a theory assembled on a sofa. It is peer-reviewed research, agency monitoring data, and named interviews. And the specific claim that nothing is going to happen has now been tested. It was tested at 46 minutes past 7, and it failed. Buildings came down, people went to hospital. 2 of them are still in critical condition. 300 residents cannot go home. If your position is that an eruption is unlikely in the near term, we agree, and so does everyone quoted here. If your position is that therefore there is nothing to be concerned about, then the events of July 31st are the answer, and they did not require an eruption to make it. There are 3 specific things I will be watching in the weeks ahead, and I would encourage you to watch them too because they are concrete and they are checkable. The first is the alert level. This caldera has sat at the same classification for years, and it did not move after the strongest earthquake in its monitored history. The next formal review by the Scientific Commission that governs that classification is a real test. If a record-breaking event that injured people and displaced hundreds does not trigger a reassessment, then it is fair to ask what the classification is actually measuring. The second is the placeholder text, Sections of red zone municipal emergency plans reportedly still carry unfinished template language where the instructions for residents should be. Those pages are now under more public scrutiny than they have ever had. Whether they get completed in the coming weeks, under maximum attention, tells you whether anything institutional actually changed on July 31st, or whether the attention simply moves on. The third is the northern edge itself. The new study identifies that boundary as the structure consistently generating these earthquakes, and as the active route for fluids heading toward the surface beneath the populated centre. If the next magnitude 4 class event lands on the same structure, and if the gas output keeps climbing while it does, then the pattern the researchers have described is not a retrospective explanation. It is a working model of a system that is still running. And that leaves one question sitting on the table, which nobody in Italy has answered yet, and which every single person living inside that red zone is entitled to ask. If the strongest earthquake ever recorded at this volcano, the one that injured people for the first time, that blocked the evacuation routes, that landed precisely on the structure feeding fluids toward the town, was not enough to change the alert level, then what exactly would be?